in the great library of Alexandria during the year 400, a scholar named Hypatia spends her quiet mornings studying the movements of stars and the elegant patterns of geometry. Surrounded by scrolls and the gentle hum of the awakening city beyond the courtyard walls. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to the luminous city of Alexandria in the early centuries of our era, where we will follow Hypatia through the peaceful rhythms of her scholarly work. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Hypatia was 45 years old, her fingers stained with the red ink of annotations, her dark eyes holding the kind of patience that comes from years of careful observation. She moved through the library with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned long ago that the best discoveries cannot be rushed. Her silver-threaded hair was bound simply, practical and unadorned, and her movements carried the quietness of a mind deeply at rest within itself. The morning light had just begun to fill the courtyard when she entered the library, as she did every day. The air held that particular warmth of early spring in Alexandria, the kind that settled gently on the skin without urgency. She made her way past the rows of shelves where countless scrolls rested in their wooden cases, each one carefully organized, each one a world unto itself. On her table, already waiting, was the work she had set aside the day before. A scroll lay partially unrolled, showing the intricate geometric pattern she had been tracing. The afternoon before, she had been studying the way circles and lines could describe the movement of celestial bodies, and this morning she found herself drawn back to it with the same quiet curiosity that had guided her since childhood. The work asked nothing of her but attention, and attention was something she gave as freely as breathing. She settled into her customary seat, a simple wooden chair worn smooth by years of use. The light from the high windows fell across the table in pale bands, illuminating the scroll before her. She picked up her stylus, a tool so familiar that her hand knew its weight without thinking, and began to examine the calculations she had made the previous day. Each mark was careful, deliberate, the result of hours spent in concentration so complete that the rest of the world had ceased to exist. There was a comfort in this work that Hypatia had come to know as intimately as her own heartbeat. The mathematics before her was not a puzzle to be solved with haste, but rather a conversation between her mind and something much larger than herself. The universe spoke in the language of numbers and forms, and she had spent her life learning to listen. Each morning, she returned to this listening with reverence and without pressure. Around her, the library continued its own quiet life. Occasionally, footsteps would sound on the stone floor as another scholar moved between the shelves, the soft rustle of papyrus being carefully unrolled, the gentle scrape of a stylus against wax tablets. These small sounds formed a kind of ambient music, a reassurance that others were engaged in the same peaceful work of understanding, the same unhurried pursuit of knowledge. Hypatia's gaze moved slowly across the geometric patterns before her. She traced with her stylus the arc of a circle, following its path through space. In her mind, she could see how this curve corresponded to the motion of a celestial body, how the elegant mathematics beneath the visible world held everything in its invisible geometry. The realization brought with it a deep sense of satisfaction, not the sharp satisfaction of conquest, but rather the mellow contentment of recognition, the moment when the world suddenly made sense, when pattern emerged from seeming chaos. She set down her stylus and allowed herself a moment of stillness. In this pause, she became aware of the quality of light in the room, the way it shifted imperceptibly as the sun moved through its ancient arc. The dust particles seemed to float in the beams like tiny celestial bodies themselves, each one moving according to principles she could measure and describe. Beauty and order suffused everything, if one simply took the time to notice. By mid-morning, a student arrived, a young man named Orestes who came several times each week to study with her. She looked up from her work as he approached, and her expression shifted into something both warm and serene. There was no urgency in her greeting, no pressure or expectation. She simply set aside her work and turned her full attention toward him, as though he were the most interesting thing that could possibly have occupied her morning. "Come," she said gently, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "I was just examining something that may interest you. Tell me first, what have you been thinking about since we last spoke?" Orestes settled into the chair, and Hypatia listened as he described his observations about the celestial movements they had discussed previously. She listened with complete attention, not interrupting, allowing him to fully express his thoughts. When he finished, she smiled, a subtle, knowing smile that suggested she had seen something in his words that warranted encouragement. "Your thinking is sound," she said. "You are learning to observe carefully, and that is the foundation of all understanding. Come, look at this." She carefully unrolled a portion of her work, turning it so that he could see clearly. "Do you see how this pattern corresponds to what you were describing?" The morning moved forward in this way, unhurried and rich with peaceful inquiry. There was no rush, no pressure to reach conclusions. Understanding, Hypatia knew, was a process that could not be forced. It arrived in its own time, like daylight gradually spreading across the horizon. When Orestes eventually departed, carrying with him the seeds of ideas to contemplate, Hypatia returned to her own work with renewed focus. The quality of the light had shifted slightly. The sun was now higher in the sky, its rays falling at a different angle. She adjusted the position of her table slightly to maintain the optimal brightness, a small adjustment made automatically by hands and eyes that had learned through countless repetitions. The afternoon arrived with the same gentle inevitability of all afternoons. The warmth in the courtyard deepened slightly. A breeze moved through the library, carrying with it the scent of the Mediterranean, salt and distant spice, and the indefinable aroma of a great city at peace with itself. Hypatia paused occasionally to breathe in this scent, finding in it a kind of grounding, a reminder of the larger world beyond the scrolls and calculations that occupied her immediate attention. She thought, as she often did, about the nature of what she was doing, the patterns she studied, the mathematics she practiced. These were not merely intellectual exercises. They were attempts to understand the deep logic that sustained the cosmos, the elegant principles upon which all visible things rested. There was something profoundly calming about this work, something that brought her closer to peace each time she engaged in it. The afternoon light continued its slow journey across the table. Hypatia continued her work with the same steady patience she had brought to every day of her scholarly life. Her hand moved with the practiced ease of someone for whom this motion had become nearly meditation. The stylus traced its paths. The scroll accumulated its annotations. Understanding deepened, moment by moment, day by day, in the quiet sanctuary of the library, where all the world's knowledge seemed to rest in peaceful waiting. Outside, the city of Alexandria carried on its bustling life. But here, in this room of scrolls and careful thought, time seemed to move at a different pace entirely, slower, gentler, more aligned with the deep rhythms of the universe itself. And Hypatia, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, moved through her work with the same quiet contentment that had sustained her through all the years of her life, asking nothing but the opportunity to understand, to observe, to listen to the profound silence at the heart of all things. The bells from the city beyond began their evening call, a muted sound that drifted through the library's high windows like a gentle reminder that the day was transitioning into dusk. Hypatia glanced upward, noticing how the quality of light had transformed once again. The sharp angles of midday had softened into something warmer, more amber-tinged. She had been working for many hours without truly noticing the passage of time. This too was familiar, this dissolution of hours into the continuous present of focused attention. She set down her stylus and allowed her eyes to rest. Stretching her fingers slowly, methodically, she felt the pleasant ache of sustained work, the kind of fatigue that brought satisfaction rather than strain. Her back settled more deeply into her chair. She breathed slowly, feeling the cool evening air beginning to move through the library as the day released its heat. It was time to move to another part of her work. She carefully rolled the geometric scroll and placed it in its designated case, handling it with the reverent care she brought to all the ancient texts. Then she moved to a different section of the library, her steps measured and thoughtful. Her work was not merely confined to mathematics and astronomy. She also devoted herself to understanding the ancient texts, the wisdom of those who had come before, preserved in these scrolls that lined the walls like a vast collective memory. She selected a scroll containing the works of Euclid, one she had studied countless times but which never ceased to reveal new dimensions of meaning. The leather case was worn smooth from handling, and she removed the scroll with practiced gentleness. Finding her familiar reading position, she unrolled it slowly, letting her eyes move across the careful handwriting of a scribe from an earlier era. There was something deeply soothing about this act of reading and rereading. Each time she encountered these words, they spoke to her slightly differently, as though the text itself shifted subtly depending on what questions she brought to it. Today, her attention was drawn to a particular proof, one that demonstrated the relationship between angles and circles. She traced the logical progression with her finger, feeling her mind move through each step with the ease of long familiarity. A colleague appeared in the doorway, an older scholar named Porphyrius who visited the library most evenings. He too was engaged in the endless work of understanding, of preserving and extending human knowledge. He nodded to Hypatia in greeting, a simple acknowledgement that required no words. They had worked in companionable silence for so many years that speech between them was often unnecessary. He knew what she was doing. She knew what he was doing. The shared purpose was enough. She continued her reading as the light gradually deepened from amber to a softer gold. The library was beginning to settle into the quietness of evening, that particular peace that descends when the day's activity winds down and the night begins its gentle ascension. Oil lamps had been lit in the distant corners by the library servants, and their soft glow added to the ambient warmth of the space. Hypatia's breathing had become slower, deeper, her body fully at ease now with the rhythm of the evening. The scroll lay open before her, and she continued to trace through the mathematical demonstrations, each one a small journey into certainty, into the crystalline clarity of logical thought. There was profound comfort in this, the knowledge that beneath the apparent confusion of the visible world lay order, harmony, proportion. Everything was connected. Everything made sense, if only one had the patience and discipline to understand it. As the evening deepened further, she became aware of the scent of the library itself, the particular aroma of aged papyrus, of leather bindings, of the stone walls that had stood for centuries. This scent had become as familiar to her as her own breath. It was the scent of home, of purpose, of a life spent in meaningful pursuit of understanding. She rolled the scroll closed with unhurried movements and replaced it carefully in its case. Her body felt comfortably tired now, the kind of pleasant fatigue that comes from a day spent in genuine engagement with work that mattered. She rose from her position slowly, allowing her muscles to adjust gradually to movement after hours of stillness. Walking through the library toward the exit, she passed rows upon rows of scrolls, each one a repository of human knowledge and insight. She ran her hand lightly along one shelf as she walked, a gesture almost like a benediction, acknowledging the centuries of thought and effort that these texts represented. The library was a sanctuary not just for herself, but for all who sought understanding. It held the accumulated wisdom of ages, and in preserving it, in studying it, in teaching it to others, she was participating in something that transcended her individual life. The courtyard outside was now bathed in the soft light of approaching twilight. The warmth that had filled it during the day was beginning to dissipate, replaced by a mild and pleasant coolness. Stars were beginning to appear in the sky above, those same celestial bodies whose movements she had been studying all day in mathematical form. Seeing them now in their actual positions in the heavens created a sense of connection, a feeling that her work in the library and the physical reality of the universe were not separate things, but rather two expressions of the same fundamental truth. She stood for a moment in the courtyard, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dimming light, her breathing to synchronize with the rhythms of the evening. Peace settled around her like a familiar garment. This too was part of her work, not the calculating, not the studying, but this quiet moment of presence, of being fully alive to the beauty and order of the world around her. A younger student, a girl named Sophia who came to study with Hypatia once each week, appeared at the library entrance. She looked somewhat uncertain, as though she had not expected to find Hypatia still there. Hypatia turned to her with a serene expression, her face soft in the dimming light. "I was just finishing for the day," Hypatia said gently. But come if you have questions. We have a few moments before full darkness arrives." They sat together on a stone bench in the courtyard, and Sophia asked about a geometric principle they had been discussing. Hypatia explained it slowly, carefully, using her hand to trace the shapes in the air, allowing Sophia to follow the logic step by step. There was no impatience in her, no sense of urgency or pressure. She had all the time in the world for genuine inquiry. When Sophia finally departed, carrying with her new understanding, Hypatia remained seated for a moment longer. The first stars were now clearly visible in the darkening sky. She recognized them, Sirius, Vega, the familiar constellations that rotated through the heavens in their eternal patterns. They had been in the sky thousands of years before she was born. They would be there thousands of years after her earthly life ended. There was something deeply consoling in this thought, a sense of participating in something far larger and more enduring than any individual existence. She rose finally and made her way home through the quieting streets of Alexandria. The city was settling into its evening rhythms. Merchants were closing their stalls. Families were gathering for their evening meals. The sounds of daily commerce were giving way to the more intimate sounds of domestic life. She moved through it all with the same calm presence she brought to her scholarly work, observing but not hurried, present but not demanding. When she reached her residence, a modest dwelling near the library, she found her chambers already prepared by the household servants. Oil lamps cast their warm glow throughout the rooms. She moved through them slowly, removing her outer garments and replacing them with soft indoor clothing. The fabric felt pleasant against her skin, comfortable and undemanding. She prepared a simple meal for herself, bread, a bit of cheese, some fruit from the market. The flavors were mild and soothing, nothing that would agitate the mind or disturb the calm that had settled over her throughout the day. As she ate, she gazed out toward the window, where the night sky was now fully established. Stars scattered across the darkness in their mathematical precision. Her mind, even in rest, continued its gentle work of understanding. She thought about the conversations she had had that day with students. She considered the geometric proofs she had been studying. She contemplated the movements of the celestial bodies, those vast and ancient dancers that moved according to principles she could describe and measure. All of it seemed to flow together in her consciousness, not as separate tasks or separate pieces of knowledge, but as expressions of a unified truth. She moved to her sleeping chamber and prepared herself for rest. The quality of the night was mild and pleasant. A gentle breeze moved through the partially open window, carrying with it the salty scent of the nearby harbor and the indefinable perfume of a great city at night. She lay down on her simple bed, feeling her body relax into its familiar shape. As her eyes grew heavy and her breathing became even more slow and deliberate, she found herself still contemplating the patterns that had occupied her attention all day. The geometry of circles, the movements of celestial bodies, the logic of Euclid's proofs. But now these thoughts were dreamlike and gentle, no longer requiring the intense focus of wakefulness, but rather drifting through her mind like clouds moving across the night sky, present, acknowledged, but not demanding engagement. The night grew deeper around her. The sounds of the city faded gradually into a peaceful quietness. In her chamber, Surrounded by the mild darkness and the subtle movements of the evening breeze, Hypatia drifted into that threshold place between wakefulness and sleep, where the boundaries between the physical world and the realm of dreams began to dissolve. Her breathing became even more subtle. Her muscles released their remaining tension. The day's work was complete. The mind that had spent itself in understanding could now rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for inquiry, new chances to listen to the universe's profound and enduring secrets. Morning arrived again as it always did, bringing with it the eternal return of light and possibility. Hypatia woke naturally, her body responding to the gradual brightening of the eastern sky beyond her window. There was no harshness in this waking, no sudden jolt. Rather, it was a gentle transition, her consciousness returning to the world with the same unhurried grace that characterized all her movements. She lay still for several moments, allowing her body to fully adjust to wakefulness. The morning air held that particular coolness that came before the day's warmth arrived, fresh, mild, inviting. She breathed it in slowly, feeling how it moved through her with each inhalation, how it seemed to carry with it the promise of another day of meaningful work. Rising from her bed, she moved through her morning preparations with deliberate slowness. She washed her face and hands with water that had been left in the basin the night before. The coolness of it against her skin was pleasant and grounding. She dressed in the same simple clothing she always wore, practical, unadorned, allowing her to move freely without distraction. Her hair, which had begun to show silver among the darker strands, bound up with the same uncomplicated simplicity she brought to all aspects of her life. By the time the first full light of dawn had arrived, she was making her way back toward the library. The streets of Alexandria at this early hour were still relatively quiet, though here and there early workers were beginning their daily tasks. Merchants were setting up stalls. Servants were carrying water and provisions. But the frenzy of midday commerce had not yet begun. The city still held something of the peace of night. The library doors were unlocked for her by an attendant who knew her habits well. Hypatia had arrived at this time nearly every morning for so many years that her presence was expected, as natural and inevitable as the sunrise itself. She made her way through the familiar corridors, past the familiar rows of scrolls, to the same table where she had worked the previous day. The scroll containing the geometric patterns lay waiting for her, exactly as she had left it. She unrolled it carefully, allowing the familiar work to reveal itself once more. But before she began her focused study, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. She looked at her hands, work-reddened, marked with years of handling papyrus and vellum and styluses, and felt a deep gratitude for their continued ability to perform the precise movements this work required. The morning light was still soft, still tinged with the amber of early dawn. As she watched, it gradually shifted, becoming more white, more direct. This transformation happened so slowly that one could not perceive the exact moment of change. Yet by mid-morning the quality of light in the library had shifted entirely. The high windows filled with brightness, and the familiar workspace became suffused with clarity. She worked steadily through the morning hours, her attention focused on a particularly intricate geometric proof. Her stylus moved carefully across the wax tablet, where she was making preliminary calculations, each mark deliberate and precise. The work required complete focus, and she gave it freely, allowing her mind to settle into that state of deep concentration where all external distractions fell away. By the time another student arrived, this time a young scholar named Marcus who came less frequently than Orestes but with genuine dedication, Hypatia had already made considerable progress. She looked up from her work as he approached, and her expression softened into warmth. She gestured for him to sit, and without hurrying, she set aside her work to give him her full attention. "Tell me," she said, "what have you been contemplating since we last spoke? What questions are moving in your mind?" Marcus described his attempts to understand a particular astronomical observation. He had been watching the position of a star at different times of night and was puzzled by the apparent changes in its position. Hypatia listened with complete focus, her posture suggesting that nothing else in the world mattered but his question. When he had finished, she rose and walked to a particular section of the library, her movements assured and purposeful. She selected a scroll containing observations made by earlier astronomers and brought it back to the table. Unrolling it carefully, she pointed to several notations. "Do you see?" she asked, her voice mild and encouraging. "Others have observed the same phenomenon. Now if we consider the position of the observer, that is, ourselves standing on the Earth as it moves through its appointed place in the cosmos, we can begin to understand how the apparent movement of the star relates to our own actual movement. The universe is not deceiving us. Rather, our perspective is incomplete. We are moving, though we cannot feel it. The star's position appears to change because we are the ones in motion." She moved through the explanation slowly, allowing him to follow each step of the logic. There was no pressure in her presentation, no suggestion that he should understand immediately. Rather, she was offering the understanding gently, as one might offer a gift, something valuable but without obligation or expectation. When Marcus finally departed, his face illuminated with the joy of new comprehension, Hypatia returned to her own work with renewed focus. The interaction with the student had not depleted her energy, but rather had channeled it into a new direction. She found herself approaching her own calculations with even greater clarity, as though the act of teaching had somehow refined her own understanding. The afternoon arrived with its characteristic heaviness, that particular quality of time that comes when the day is fully established. The library seemed to slow its pace. Fewer people moved through its corridors. Those who were present worked with absorbed focus, each one engaged in their own private journey of understanding. The atmosphere was that of a sacred space, not because of any formal religious designation, but because it held the concentrated effort of many minds seeking truth. Hypatia stood and moved to the window, allowing herself a brief respite from her intense work. The courtyard below was bathed in strong afternoon light. The marble stones seemed to glow softly. A few people moved across the space, scholars, servants, the attendants who maintained the library's function. Everything moved with a kind of measured grace, as though the space itself imposed a certain rhythm on all who inhabited it. She observed for several moments, watching how the light fell on the stones, how the shadows shifted subtly as the sun continued its ancient arc. There was mathematics in this too, in the angle of the light, in the geometry of shadow and illumination. The entire universe was a study in relationships, proportions, the elegant interactions of form and force. Returning to her work, she found herself approaching a particularly challenging problem. One of her students from the previous week had asked her about the relationship between the circle and the square, how one might convert the area of one shape into the other. It was an ancient question, one that philosophers and mathematicians had contemplated for centuries. She was not certain there was a solution, yet the contemplation of the problem itself held value. She worked through various approaches, each one taking her down a slightly different path of logical investigation. Some seemed promising but eventually reached dead ends. Others suggested new angles of approach. The work was not frustrating despite the difficulty. Rather, there was something deeply satisfying about the honest grappling with a genuine puzzle, even, or perhaps especially, when the solution remained elusive. As the afternoon deepened, the quality of the light began to shift again. The harsh brightness of midday softened into something warmer, more amber-tinged. This shift signaled the approaching transition toward evening. Hypatia had learned long ago to read these signals in the light, to understand the day's progression through the subtle changes in how the sun illuminated the world. She set aside the geometric problem that had occupied her and turned her attention instead to reviewing and organizing her notes. This too was important work, not the discovery of new understanding, but the careful cataloging and preservation of what had already been comprehended. She moved through pages of notes and calculations, checking them for accuracy, making small corrections where her memory suggested improvements, ensuring that the record of her thinking would be clear to anyone who might read it in years to come. This work was almost meditative in its quality. There was no pressure, no race against time. She simply moved through the materials, ensuring their clarity and coherence, treating each notation as though it were a small gift to her future self or to others who might someday benefit from her thinking. By the time the evening bells began their distant call, she had processed a considerable volume of material. Her hands felt pleasantly tired. Her eyes, though focused and clear, carried the awareness of many hours spent in concentrated attention. She began to prepare the materials for the night, placing scrolls carefully back in their cases, setting aside the wax tablets, ensuring that her workspace would be ready for the next day's work. She stood and stretched slowly, allowing her body to adjust to movement after long hours of sitting. Her back straightened gradually. Her arms rose above her head, and she felt the gentle ache of muscles that had held themselves in position for extended periods. This too was familiar and acceptable, the price paid for work that mattered. The library was beginning to settle into its evening rhythm now. The oil lamps were being lit by the attendants, casting their warm glow throughout the corridors. Hypatia made her way through these familiar passages one final time that day, noting with quiet satisfaction the order that prevailed, the careful preservation of humanity's accumulated knowledge. She paused before one particular shelf, running her fingers lightly across the spines of several scrolls. These texts had traveled to Alexandria from distant lands, representing the thoughts of philosophers and scientists from across the known world. In this library, all these voices could exist together in harmony, each one contributing its own insights to the great conversation about the nature of reality and the principles that govern the cosmos. It was a profound privilege, she thought, to have access to these materials, and even more profound to have the time and capacity to study them, to build upon them, to extend the understanding they represented. Not everyone in the world had such an opportunity. She was aware of her good fortune, though she never allowed this awareness to become complacency. Rather, it fueled her commitment to use her gifts as fully as possible, to honor the opportunity through genuine engagement. As she exited the library into the cooling evening air, the stars were already beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. She stood for a moment in the courtyard, looking upward, observing the familiar constellations that were beginning their nightly ascension. Tomorrow, she will study their movements mathematically. Tonight, she could simply observe them with the quiet appreciation of one who understood their nature and respected their ancient dance. The walk home through the evening streets of Alexandria was peaceful and familiar. She moved at her customary unhurried pace, noticing the subtle details of the city as it transitioned toward night. The way merchants were closing their stalls, the smell of evening cooking arising from houses, the gradual dimming of the light, and the simultaneous brightening of the stars. In her chamber that evening, she sat by her window with a cup of warm herbal drink, mint and chamomile steeped in water that the household servant had prepared. The flavors were mild and soothing, neither stimulating nor demanding. She sipped slowly, allowing the warmth to settle into her body, watching as the night deepened around the city beyond her window. Her mind continued its gentle work, but without the intense focus it had maintained during the day. She thought about the students she had encountered, about the problems she had contemplated, about the vast architecture of mathematical and astronomical knowledge that she had devoted her life to understanding and preserving. These thoughts were comfortable, familiar, requiring no urgent resolution or intense engagement. As the night deepened, she prepared herself for sleep. The mild darkness of her chamber was soothing. The sounds of the city had diminished to quiet murmurs. She lay down on her bed, feeling her body settle into its familiar shape, feeling her breathing gradually slow and deepen. The contemplation of circles and stars continued gently in her mind, but without urgency now, without the need for precision and focus. These thoughts drifted like the stars themselves, present, acknowledged, beautiful, but not demanding anything of her except recognition and gratitude for their existence. Sleep came gradually, as it always did, bringing with it the promise of another day, another opportunity to engage in the work that gave her life meaning and purpose. And as she drifted into that peaceful darkness, she carried with her the deep contentment of one who had spent her day in genuine pursuit of understanding, who had given her gifts fully and received the generous rewards of meaningful work. The night settled around her like a gentle embrace. Outside her window, the stars continued their eternal rotation through the heavens, moving according to the principles she had devoted her life to comprehending. All was well. All was in order. All was unfolding according to the elegant mathematics that governed all things. The third day arrived with the soft inevitability of all days, bringing with it the eternal cycle of light and shadow, activity and rest. Hypatia woke once more to the gradual brightening of the sky, her body responding naturally to the rhythms that had governed her existence for decades. The morning held the same gentle quality as all mornings, the same coolness in the air, the same promise of another day devoted to the work that sustained her spirit. She moved through her morning preparations with the familiar sequence of actions: washing, dressing, the binding of her hair, each movement flowing into the next with the ease of long repetition. Her work-reddened hands moved automatically, requiring no conscious direction. By the time she emerged into the street, the city was already beginning to stir with the activity of a new day. The walk to the library took her through familiar streets, past familiar faces. There was the fruit seller who always nodded to her in greeting. There was the young boy who swept the steps of a nearby dwelling, his movements quick despite his obvious tiredness. There were the other early risers, servants, workers, other scholars bent on their own pursuits. Hypatia moved among them all with calm presence, observing without judgment, moving without hurry. When she arrived at the library, it was still quite quiet. The attendants had only just begun their morning preparations, opening windows to allow the fresh morning air to circulate through the corridors. Hypatia made her way to her customary table, where everything remained exactly as she had left it the previous afternoon. The scrolls lay in their careful arrangement. The wax tablets held her latest calculations. The styluses waited in their container, ready for use. She settled into her chair with a deep sigh of contentment. This was home in a way that her actual dwelling could never be, not because it was more comfortable, but because it was the place where her true work lived, where the focus of her existence found its complete expression. She unrolled the scroll containing the geometric problem she had been contemplating, and allowed her mind to fully enter that realm of pure mathematics where everything was certain, where every truth could be proven through patient logical progression. The morning light gradually filled the library, shifting from the pale gold of dawn to the clearer brightness of full morning. Hypatia's attention never wavered from her work. Her stylus moved across the wax tablet in careful strokes, each mark deliberate and precise. She was exploring a new approach to the problem of converting the area of a circle into the area of a square, an ancient puzzle that had occupied the minds of great mathematicians for centuries. The work led her down various pathways of inquiry. Some seemed promising initially, but eventually revealed themselves to be dead ends. Others suggested new angles that she had not previously contemplated. There was no frustration in this process, only the steady engagement of her mind with genuine intellectual difficulty. She welcomed the challenge, understanding that the value lay not necessarily in reaching a final answer, but in the quality of the thinking that the problem demanded. By mid-morning, the library had begun to fill with its daily population of scholars and students. Some merely passed through, searching for particular texts. Others, like Hypatia, had claimed their own spaces where they worked throughout the day. There was a young woman who studied rhetoric in one corner. There were several monks from a nearby monastery who came regularly to copy texts. There were merchants seeking practical knowledge about mathematics for their trading calculations. The library served them all, welcoming everyone who came with genuine desire for understanding. A new student approached Hypatia's table, a boy who could not have been more than 16 years old, with the nervous energy of someone not yet confident in their own intellectual abilities. Hypatia looked up from her work and immediately set it aside, giving the boy her complete attention. "Welcome," she said simply. "What brings you to the library today? What questions are you carrying with you?" The boy hesitated, struggling to articulate his thoughts. He eventually explained that he had been assigned to study geometry by his tutor, but he found the principles difficult to grasp. Hypatia listened carefully, her face open and encouraging, showing no impatience despite the interruption to her own work. "Come," she said, "let us begin with something simple. Tell me, do you see the window there?" She gestured toward one of the high windows of the library. "Observe its shape carefully. What do you notice?" The boy studied the window, and Hypatia waited in patient silence for his response. Eventually, he ventured that it was rectangular in shape. Hypatia smiled, not mockingly, but with genuine appreciation for his observation. "Exactly," she said. "Now, the rectangle is one of the most fundamental shapes in all of geometry. Everything complex in this world is built from simple shapes like the rectangle and the circle and the triangle. If we can understand how these simple shapes relate to one another, how they measure, how they transform, we begin to understand the structure of the entire universe." She spent the next half hour with the boy, using simple examples and patient explanations to help him grasp the basic principles of geometric measurement. Her work-reddened fingers traced shapes in the air and on wax tablets. Her dark eyes held a quality of complete focus and gentle encouragement. By the time the boy departed, he carried with him not just new understanding, but a sense of confidence that he too could grasp these principles if he approached them with patient attention. As the afternoon approached, Hypatia returned to her own work with renewed clarity. The conversation with the student had somehow refined her own thinking. She found herself approaching the geometric problem from a new angle, discovering connections she had not previously perceived. Her stylus moved with renewed purpose across the wax tablet, and she felt that particular joy that comes when understanding suddenly deepens, when patterns that were previously obscure suddenly become visible. The afternoon light continued its slow journey across the library. The quality of illumination changed incrementally, moving from the clear brightness of midday toward the warmer tones of late afternoon. Hypatia remained absorbed in her work, barely noticing these shifts in light, or rather, noticing them only on the periphery of her consciousness, allowing them to inform her understanding of time's passage without interrupting her concentration. Another colleague approached, an older scholar named Aristotle, though not the famous Aristotle of ancient times, but a man who shared his namesake's love of careful observation and logical thought. He carried several scrolls and gestured toward the empty seat at Hypatia's table with a questioning expression. "May I work nearby?" he asked, knowing that she appreciated having scholarly companions around her during her studies. "Of course," she replied warmly. "Set yourself down. It is always good to have others engaged in genuine inquiry. The presence of focused minds somehow reinforces and supports our own efforts." They worked in companionable silence for several hours, occasionally glancing up from their respective tasks to exchange a knowing look or to point out something of interest in the materials before them. Neither felt the need for constant conversation. Their shared commitment to understanding was enough. The silence between them was rich and full, not empty or awkward, but rather a kind of communion between two minds devoted to similar purposes. As the afternoon deepened into early evening, Hypatia became aware that she had been working for many hours without noticeable fatigue. This too was familiar, the way time dissolved when she was fully engaged in her work, the way her body seemed to have endless reserves of energy when her mind was genuinely interested in what it was doing. She set aside her stylus and allowed herself a moment of complete rest. She stretched slowly, feeling her muscles acknowledge the hours of focused sitting. She breathed deeply, allowing her mind to step back from the intense concentration of the work and simply observe with calm awareness the space around her. The library in the late afternoon held a particular quality of peaceful industriousness. The light had shifted to that golden tone that suggested the day was nearing its close. The sounds of scholars quietly working, the scratch of styluses, the soft rustle of papyrus being unrolled, the occasional quiet footstep, created an ambient music that was deeply soothing to her. She thought about the various students she had worked with that day, the nervous young boy, the careful Orestes who came regularly, the others who had stopped by with questions. Each one represented a continuation of a tradition of inquiry that stretched back centuries. In teaching them, she was not simply imparting information, but was rather passing forward the torch of understanding, ensuring that the light of human knowledge would continue to burn brightly in the minds of coming generations. This thought brought with it a deep sense of peace and rightness. Her life had meaning. Her work had purpose. She was contributing something of genuine value to the continuity of human understanding. As the evening bells began their distant call, Hypatia began the familiar process of organizing her materials and preparing them for the night. She placed her wax tablet carefully in its designated spot. She rolled the geometric scroll and returned it to its case. She made notes about where she would resume the next day, so that when she returned in the morning, the threads of her thinking would be immediately available. She rose from her table and moved through the library for the final time that day, passing along the familiar corridors, observing the order and careful arrangement that had been maintained through centuries of scholarship. The knowledge contained in these scrolls and texts, the mathematics, the astronomy, the philosophy, the practical wisdom of countless minds, all of it was preserved here, available to anyone with the genuine desire to understand. The courtyard outside was now bathed in the amber light of late afternoon, approaching evening. The air held that particular quality of coolness that suggested the day's heat was beginning to release. Hypatia stood for a moment, looking upward toward the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear even in the lingering daylight. She recognized them, these same stars that had looked down on her since childhood, that would continue to look down long after she had passed from this world. There was comfort in this eternal continuity, in being part of something so much larger and more enduring than any individual life. The walk home took her through the streets of Alexandria as evening settled fully around the city. The marketplace was beginning to quiet. Families were gathering for their evening meals. The sounds of the day's commerce were giving way to the more intimate sounds of domestic life. She moved through it all with her characteristic calm, observing without judgment, moving without haste. When she arrived at her dwelling, she found her evening meal already prepared, simple food, nourishing but not elaborate. She sat and ate slowly, allowing each flavor to register, grateful for the care that the household servants took in maintaining her comfort. As she ate, she gazed out toward the street, watching the final light of day gradually fade from the sky. After her meal, she moved to her window and sat for a time simply observing the night as it deepened around the city. The stars were now fully visible, shining with steadfast brightness against the darkness. She contemplated their positions, thinking about the observations she had made regarding their movements, considering the mathematical principles that govern their apparent trajectories through the heavens. There was profound satisfaction in understanding something about the nature of reality, in being able to perceive a phenomenon, and then to comprehend the principles that underlay it. This was the deepest reward of her work, deeper than any external recognition or acclaim. It was the satisfaction of the mind meeting genuine truth and recognizing it with clarity and certainty. As the night grew late, she prepared herself for sleep. The coolness of the night air moved through her open window, carrying with it the sense of the Mediterranean and the indefinable aroma of a great city at rest. She lay down on her bed, feeling her body settle into its familiar position, feeling her breathing gradually slow and deepen. The thoughts that had occupied her mind throughout the day continued their gentle work, but now without urgency or pressure. The geometric problem she had been contemplating seemed to shift and reform in her consciousness, approaching from new angles, gradually revealing its structure. But these were not thoughts that demanded active engagement. Rather, they drifted like the stars themselves, present and beautiful but not insistent. Her awareness of the physical world gradually faded. The sounds of the city diminished to near silence. The coolness of the night air, the texture of her bedding, the rhythm of her own breathing, all of these sensations gradually moved from the foreground of her consciousness to the background, becoming less immediate, less demanding of attention. Sleep came gradually, bringing with it the promise of tomorrow, another day in which she could continue her work, another opportunity to engage in the great conversation between the human mind and the eternal principles that governed all existence. And as she drifted into peaceful darkness, she carried with her the deep contentment of one whose life was devoted to meaningful purpose, whose daily work was also her deepest calling, whose mind was perpetually engaged in the most noble of human pursuits, the endless, patient, humble seeking of understanding. The fourth morning arrived as all mornings do, inevitable and gentle, carrying with it the renewal of light and the promise of another day of quiet work. Hypatia woke to the soft brightening of her chamber, her body responding to rhythms that had become ingrained through decades of living by natural cycles rather than by artificial urgency. She rose slowly, allowing her body to adjust to wakefulness without haste. Her 45-year-old frame moved through the familiar sequence of morning preparations with the ease of long repetition. The water for washing was cool against her work-reddened hands, refreshing her, grounding her in the present moment. She dressed in the same simple garments, functional, unadorned, allowing complete freedom of movement, and bound her graying brown hair with the same quiet care she brought to all things. The morning streets of Alexandria held that particular quality of relative quietness that existed in the early hours before the day's commerce began in earnest. Hypatia moved through them as she always did, observing without haste, moving without urgency. She passed the same fruit seller, now arranging his wares for the day. She passed the same young boy sweeping the steps, his movements slightly less tired than the previous day. She passed other scholars, other workers, each one engaged in their own small routines that made up the larger pattern of the city's existence. When she arrived at the library, the attendants were just finishing their morning preparations. The windows had been opened, and fresh morning air circulated through the corridors. The oil lamps from the previous evening had been extinguished and cleaned. Everything was in readiness for another day of scholarly work. Hypatia made her way to her customary table, nodding with quiet satisfaction that everything remained exactly as she had left it. Her materials were organized, her notes were accessible, the scrolls waited in their cases. She settled into her chair, feeling the familiar wood beneath her, feeling the particular peace that came from returning to a space that had become as familiar as her own dwelling. But before she began the focused work of the day, she allowed herself a moment of simple presence. She observed the quality of the morning light as it filled the library, watched how it illuminated the dust particles that floated in the air, noticed the subtle variations in tone and color as the light shifted through the high windows. There was always something new to observe, even in the most familiar surroundings. The light was never quite the same from one day to the next. The shadows fell at slightly different angles. The colors shifted imperceptibly. Life, she had come to understand, was fundamentally about attention, about noticing, observing, allowing one's awareness to remain open to the infinite variations that occurred within seemingly consistent patterns. She unrolled the geometric scroll once more, returning to the problem that had occupied so much of her thinking over the past days. The puzzle of converting the area of a circle into the area of a square, a problem that had resisted solution from the greatest minds who had confronted it across the centuries. Hypatia did not expect to solve it. She had become comfortable with the possibility that some questions might not yield answers in the way that other problems could be resolved. Yet there was value in the asking, in the patient contemplation, in the honest engagement with genuine intellectual difficulty. Her stylus moved across the wax tablet, exploring new pathways of thought. She considered the problem from the perspective of ratios and proportions. She thought about the nature of infinity, how the circle, with its continuous curve, related to the square, with its distinct corners and straight sides. These were not merely abstract exercises. They were attempts to understand something fundamental about the nature of mathematical reality. The morning moved forward in this way, her mind fully absorbed in the work, her body still, her attention undivided. Time seemed to dissolve. Hours passed without her noticing their passage until the quality of the light began to shift subtly, indicating that midday was approaching. At this point, a scholar she had not seen before approached her table. He was younger than many of her regular students, perhaps only in his early 20s, with an intensity in his expression that suggested genuine intellectual hunger. He introduced himself as Nicomedes and recently arrived in Alexandria to study mathematics and astronomy. "I have heard," he said respectfully, "that you are the finest teacher of mathematics in the city. I would very much appreciate the opportunity to study under your guidance, if you would be willing." Hypatia looked at him calmly, assessing him not with judgment but with the gentle observation of one experienced in recognizing genuine intellectual commitment. She saw in him the marks of sincerity, the careful way he had phrased his request, the genuine uncertainty in his voice, the lack of arrogance despite his obvious intelligence. "Come," she said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Let us begin by examining what you already understand. Tell me, what brings you to the study of mathematics? What draws you to these pursuits?" For the next hour, she listened as Nicomedes described his journey, his early fascination with the stars, his desire to understand the principles that govern the movements of celestial bodies, his recognition that mathematical knowledge was essential to this understanding. Hypatia listened with complete attention, her dark eyes focused entirely on him, her posture open and encouraging. When he had finished, she began to guide him through some fundamental principles, but her teaching was not a simple transmission of information. Rather, it was a careful process of asking questions designed to help him discover understanding for himself. She would present a problem and then wait, allowing him to struggle with it, knowing that the struggle itself was the most valuable part of the learning process. "You see," she explained at one point, "understanding is not something that can be poured from one vessel into another like water. Rather, it must be cultivated, developed, allowed to grow in the mind of the student through genuine engagement with the material. My role is not to give you answers, but to provide the right questions and the patient space in which to explore them." By the time Nicomedes departed in the early afternoon, carrying with him a list of texts to read and problems to contemplate, his face had transformed. The intensity that had been present in his expression when he arrived had not diminished, but it had been channeled into a more directed and purposeful form. He now carried within him not just answers, but the beginning of genuine understanding, the recognition that mathematics was not a collection of arbitrary rules, but rather a coherent system describing the deep logic of reality. Hypatia returned to her own work with renewed focus, the interaction with the student having somehow reinforced her own commitment to the contemplation she was pursuing. The afternoon stretched before her, rich with possibility, with time and space to pursue her inquiries as deeply as she wished. She worked through the afternoon with steady concentration, exploring various mathematical approaches to the geometric problem. She found herself following a particular line of inquiry that seemed promising, an exploration of the relationship between ratios and areas that suggested new possibilities she had not previously considered. As she worked, she became aware of a particular quality of peace that seemed to be deepening throughout the day. It was not the absence of challenge or difficulty. The mathematical problem remained genuinely complex, but rather a profound sense of rightness about being engaged in meaningful work, of using her gifts in service to something larger than herself. The afternoon light gradually shifted into that particular golden tone that announced the approach of evening. Hypatia became aware that she had been working for many hours, yet she felt no fatigue, no sense of imposition or burden. Rather, there was a kind of energization that came from being completely absorbed in work that mattered. She set aside her materials as the evening bells began their distant call, engaging in the familiar process of organizing her work for the night. She made careful notes about where she would resume, ensuring that the threads of her thinking would be immediately accessible the next morning. She returned the scrolls to their proper places, treating each one with the reverence that all ancient knowledge deserved. As she walked through the library corridors for the final time that day, she observed the other scholars beginning to pack away their own materials. The library was transitioning into its evening rhythm, the period of winding down from the day's focused intensity. In the courtyard outside, the first stars were already visible in the darkening sky despite the lingering traces of sunset on the western horizon. Hypatia paused for a moment, looking upward, feeling the connection between herself, standing here on the earth, and those distant points of light that she had devoted her life to understanding. The walk home through the evening streets was peaceful and familiar. The city was settling into its evening routines. Merchants were closing their stalls. Families were gathering for their evening meals. The sounds of daily commerce were giving way to the quieter rhythms of domestic life. When she arrived at her dwelling, she found that her evening meal had been prepared. A simple soup of vegetables and herbs, bread still warm from baking, water flavored with lemon. She ate slowly, savoring each element, grateful for the nourishment and for the care that the household servants took in maintaining her comfort despite her simple and undemanding nature. After her meal, she moved to the window and sat observing the night as it deepened around the city. The stars became progressively more visible as the last traces of sunset faded from the sky. She contemplated their positions, thinking about the calculations she had made regarding their movements, considering how her mathematical work helped her to understand what her eyes were observing. There was particular satisfaction in this integration of theoretical understanding and direct observation. Mathematics was not something separate from the physical world, but rather was the language in which the physical world expressed itself. By learning this language, she was learning to read the nature of reality itself. As the night grew late, she prepared herself for sleep. She lay on her bed, feeling her body relax into the familiar position, feeling her breathing gradually become slower and deeper. The mathematical problems she had been working on continued to exist at the edge of her consciousness, not demandingly, but gently, like thoughts about dear friends. Her awareness of the physical world gradually faded. The coolness of the night air, the sounds of the city diminished to near silence, the texture of her bedding, all of these became less immediate, less demanding of attention. Her mind drifted into that threshold space between wakefulness and sleep, where the boundaries between the physical world and the realm of imagination and dreams began to dissolve. The stars she had observed from her window seemed to continue their eternal rotation in her consciousness, even as her body released into sleep. The mathematical patterns she had been contemplating seemed to shift and reform, approaching from new angles, gradually revealing new aspects of their structure and significance. Sleep embraced her fully, bringing with it the promise of tomorrow, another day in which to continue the work, another opportunity to engage with the mysteries of the cosmos, another chance to contribute to the great conversation between human understanding and the eternal principles that governed all existence. And in the darkness of her chamber, surrounded by the mild night air and the distant presence of the stars, Hypatia rested peacefully, her mind at ease, her body at rest, her spirit content in the knowledge that her life was devoted to meaningful purpose, that her daily work was an expression of her deepest values, that she was participating in something noble and eternal. The endless human effort to understand the nature of reality itself. The fifth day brought with it the familiar rhythm that had become the foundation of Hypatia's existence. She woke to the gradual brightening of her chamber, her breathing naturally synchronizing with the emerging morning light. There was no abruptness to her waking, no jarring transition from sleep to consciousness. Rather, it was a gentle progression, like the slow shift from darkness to dawn itself. She moved through her morning preparations with the unhurried grace that characterized all her movements. Her work-reddened hands moved through the familiar sequence, washing, dressing, binding her graying brown hair, each action flowing seamlessly into the next. By the time she stepped into the street, the city was beginning its own awakening, merchants preparing their wares, workers moving toward their daily tasks. The path to the library was so familiar that her feet could have found their way even in complete darkness. She had walked this same route countless times, had observed the same places, and had become part of the rhythm of this particular corner of Alexandria. The city, in turn, had come to know her, the elderly scholar who moved through its streets with quiet purpose, who lived a life of profound simplicity despite her obvious learning. When she arrived at the library, she found it already stirring with activity. Other scholars were settling into their customary workspaces. Attendants were tending to the materials, ensuring that everything was in its proper place. The library was coming alive for another day of focused inquiry and careful preservation of humanity's accumulated knowledge. Hypatia made her way to her familiar table and settled into her chair. Before beginning her concentrated work, she allowed herself a moment to simply observe the quality of the morning within the library. The light fell through the high windows in precise beams, illuminating dust particles that seemed to dance in the air. The ambient sounds, the soft movements of other scholars, the gentle rustle of papyrus being handled carefully, the occasional quiet footstep, created a kind of symphony of intellectual engagement. She unrolled her geometric scroll, returning once again to the problem that had occupied so much of her attention over the past days. The puzzle of the circle and the square remained as intriguing as ever, yet she found that her approach to it had subtly shifted. Where before she had been seeking a definitive solution, She now found herself more interested in the deeper exploration of the relationships involved, in understanding the problem itself at a more fundamental level. This shift in perspective, from seeking an answer to seeking understanding, represented something profound about her approach to mathematics and astronomy. The work was not ultimately about arriving at conclusions, but about the quality of the inquiry itself, about maintaining her mind in a state of openness and receptivity to genuine truth. The morning progressed with steady concentration. Her stylus moved across the wax tablet, recording calculations, exploring relationships, following lines of logic wherever they might lead. There was no pressure, no sense that she needed to reach a particular destination by a particular time. Rather, there was only the present moment, the work before her, the engagement of her mind with genuinely difficult material. By mid-morning, Nicomedes returned, the young scholar who had approached her the previous day. He carried with him several texts and a collection of notes, evidence that he had engaged seriously with the materials she had recommended. His expression held both excitement and a kind of humble uncertainty, the marks of genuine intellectual progress. "I have read the texts you suggested," he said, settling into the chair beside her, "and I have worked through the problems, but I find myself with more questions now than I had before. Is this progress?" Hypatia smiled, a subtle expression that conveyed both amusement and genuine warmth. "Yes," she replied gently. "This is precisely the correct kind of progress. When a mind begins to truly engage with genuine intellectual material, it naturally generates new questions. The multiplication of questions is a sign that understanding is beginning to develop. A mind that asks no questions is a mind that has not yet begun to think deeply." She spent the next several hours with Nicomedes, guiding him through the materials, helping him to organize his thinking, encouraging him to push deeper into his investigations. She demonstrated particular techniques for problem solving, showed him how to approach difficult material with patience and systematic care, and modeled the kind of intellectual humility that recognized the vastness of what remained unknown, even as one gradually increased one's own understanding. By the time Nicomedes departed in the early afternoon, he carried with him not just new information, but a transformed sense of his own capacity for learning. He had begun to understand that intellectual growth was possible, that the mysteries of mathematics and astronomy were not beyond his reach, that patient engagement with genuine material could yield real understanding. Hypatia returned to her own work with that particular quality of satisfaction that came from successful teaching. She had planted seeds that would, she hoped, continue to grow in her student's mind long after he ceased to study directly with her. This was one of the deepest rewards of her work, the knowledge that her understanding could be transmitted to younger minds, that the light of inquiry could be passed forward across generations. The afternoon deepened, and Hypatia found herself approaching the geometric problem from yet another new angle. She had discovered a relationship between the circle and the square that seemed to suggest new possibilities, even if a complete solution remained elusive. There was satisfaction in this incremental progress, in the knowledge that even if she never fully resolved the ancient puzzle, she had still deepened human understanding of it in some meaningful way. As the afternoon shifted toward evening, the quality of light in the library underwent its familiar transformation. The harsh brightness of midday softened into warmer tones, becoming more amber and golden. This shift always signaled to Hypatia that the day was approaching its natural close, that the time for concentrated work was beginning to give way to the transition toward night and rest. She began to organize her materials, preparing them for the night. She made careful notes about where she would resume her work, ensuring continuity between one day and the next. She rolled her scrolls carefully and returned them to their cases, each action performed with the reverence and care that ancient knowledge deserved. As she walked through the library corridors for the final time that day, she paused occasionally to observe other scholars at their work. There was an old man studying ancient texts on medicine. There was a young woman copying passages from a philosophical work. There were monks preserving and transmitting knowledge. All of them were engaged in the great work of understanding and preservation, each one contributing their own effort to the vast human project of comprehending the nature of reality. In the courtyard outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, even as the western horizon still held traces of sunset light. Hypatia paused to observe them, feeling the particular connection that came from having devoted her life to understanding their nature and movements. The walk home through the evening streets was peaceful and familiar. The city was settling into its evening routines, families gathering, conversations and laughter drifting from open windows, the sounds of commerce gradually giving way to the sounds of domestic life. She moved through it all with her characteristic calm presence, observing without judgment, moving without haste. When she arrived home, her evening meal was prepared, a simple but nourishing dish of lentils and herbs, bread, water. She ate slowly, allowing her mind to gradually release from the intense focus of the day. As she ate, she gazed out toward the street, watching the evening deepen into night. After her meal, she moved to her window and sat observing the night sky as it emerged. The stars grew progressively more visible as the last light faded from the western horizon. She contemplated their patterns, thinking about the observations she had made regarding their movements, considering how her mathematical work illuminated what her eyes were observing. There was profound satisfaction in this integration of theory and observation. Her life's work, both the mathematical investigations and the astronomical observations, all fit together into a coherent whole, a unified pursuit of understanding the deep principles that govern the cosmos. As the night grew late, she prepared herself for sleep. She lay on her bed, feeling her body settle into its familiar position, feeling her breathing gradually slow and deepen. The mathematical problems continued their gentle dance at the edge of her consciousness, not demandingly but peacefully, like beloved thoughts that required no urgent resolution. Her awareness gradually shifted from the physical world to something more dreamlike and subtle. The boundaries between her individual consciousness and something larger began to blur. The stars she had observed seemed to continue their eternal rotation even in her sleeping mind. The mathematical patterns she had been contemplating seemed to shift and reform, approaching from new perspectives, gradually revealing deeper levels of their structure and significance. sleep came fully, bringing with it the deepest rest, the complete release of her body and mind from the focused engagement of wakefulness. In this sleep, she dreamed of infinite patterns, of circles expanding and contracting, of mathematical relationships expressed in forms of extraordinary beauty. The dreams held no urgency, no pressure, but rather a quality of profound peace and rightness. And as she rested through the night, the city of Alexandria continued its own existence around her. The great library with its countless scrolls preserving humanity's knowledge, the stars moving through their ancient patterns in the heavens above, the vast Mediterranean extending beyond the city toward distant shores. All of it was part of the great order that she had devoted her life to understanding, the elegant principles that governed all existence from the smallest particular to the vast whole of the cosmos. Morning came again, as mornings always do, bringing with it the renewal of light and the promise of another day. Hypatia woke gradually, naturally, her body responding to the subtle shifts in light that preceded the full dawn. She rose and moved through her familiar morning preparations with the ease of long repetition. By the time she stepped into the street, another day was beginning in Alexandria, and she moved toward the library with the same quiet purpose that had directed her steps for decades. When she arrived at her customary workplace, she found it ready for her arrival, the materials organized, the scrolls in their proper places, the familiar space waiting for her return. She settled into her chair and looked at the geometric problem that had occupied so much of her attention over the past days. But before she began her concentrated work, she allowed herself a moment of deeper reflection. She thought about the nature of her life, how it was devoted entirely to the pursuit of understanding, how each day followed a similar pattern of focused inquiry and patient engagement with difficult material. Some might have seen such a life as monotonous or restricted, but she knew it to be precisely the opposite. Within the apparently simple pattern of her daily existence lay infinite variety and depth. Each day's work with mathematics revealed new dimensions of understanding. Each observation of the stars added to her comprehension of the cosmos. Each encounter with a student became an opportunity to discover new insights through the process of teaching. The pattern itself was what made the richness possible. It provided the necessary structure and continuity within which genuine depth could develop. She picked up her stylus and returned to her work, her mind settling into that familiar state of complete focus and peaceful engagement. The morning stretched before her, rich with possibility, and she moved into it with the quiet confidence of one whose life had found its truest expression in the endless pursuit of understanding. The work continued, day after day, in the same peaceful rhythm, the same patterns of rising and walking to the library, of settling into focused engagement with materials both ancient and new, of teaching students who came seeking genuine understanding, of observing the stars and working to comprehend their movements. And in this rhythm, in this devotion to genuine inquiry, Hypatia found the deepest peace, not the peace of escape or denial, but the peace of a life lived in full alignment with one's deepest values and purposes. Several weeks passed in this manner, each day unfolding with the gentle inevitability of natural cycles. Hypatia's routine remained consistent, the morning walk to the library, the focused work on mathematical and astronomical problems, the teaching of students who came seeking understanding, the observation of the stars in the evening, the return home to rest and renewal. Yet within this consistent pattern, profound developments occurred. Nicomedes, under her guidance, had begun to develop genuine mastery of geometric principles. His mind, which had initially struggled with the concepts, now moved through mathematical territory with increasing confidence and clarity. Other students came and went, some staying for only a few sessions before moving on to other pursuits, others becoming regular companions in the library's work of understanding. One afternoon, as Hypatia was working on a particularly intricate astronomical calculation, an older scholar approached her table. His name was Theon, and he was known throughout Alexandria as a man of profound learning and generous spirit. He had himself studied the movements of celestial bodies and had made significant contributions to astronomical knowledge. "I have heard much about your work," Theon said, settling into the chair beside her. "The other scholars speak of you with great respect. I confess I am curious to see what occupies your attention so completely." Hypatia looked up from her calculations and gestured to the materials before her. "I am attempting to understand the mathematical relationship between the movements of the celestial bodies and the geometric patterns they seem to express," she explained. "I have been observing the position of Venus at different times of year, and I believe there may be a regular pattern to its movement, a mathematical principle that governs its apparent path through the sky." Theon leaned forward, examining her notes and calculations. As he studied her work, his expression shifted to one of genuine appreciation. "This is remarkable," he said. "You have approached this problem from an angle I had not previously considered. Your observations are meticulous, and your mathematical analysis is elegant." They spent the remainder of the afternoon in conversation, discussing astronomical phenomena, exchanging observations, and exploring theoretical frameworks. It was rare for Hypatia to have the opportunity to discuss her work with someone of equal learning, and she found the exchange energizing rather than exhausting. When Theon finally departed, he carried with him several of her notes, asking permission to study them further and to discuss them with other scholars in the city. Hypatia gave her consent freely, understanding that genuine knowledge was something to be shared and built upon collectively rather than guarded protectively. The encounter with Theon seemed to deepen Hypatia's own sense of purpose. She had spent so much of her life working in relative solitude, content with the quiet satisfaction of her own understanding. But now, as she witnessed how her insights could contribute to larger conversations, she felt a renewed sense of connection to the broader community of scholars. The weeks continued their progression. The seasons shifted gradually from spring toward summer. The quality of the light changed incrementally. The heat increased slowly, day by day. But within the library, the work continued with its characteristic calm, unaffected by the external changes in climate and season. One morning, as Hypatia settled into her customary workspace, she found a new scroll waiting for her, a gift from Theon. It contained detailed astronomical observations made over many years, recording the positions of stars and planets at regular intervals. He had included a note expressing his hope that she might find the observations useful for her own work. Hypatia spent the entire morning and much of the afternoon studying Theon's observations. She cross-referenced them with her own notes and calculations, looking for patterns, exploring relationships. As she worked, she made several discoveries, correlations between the observations that seemed to suggest deeper principles governing celestial movements. By late afternoon, she had filled several wax tablets with new calculations based on this integrated understanding. The work felt important, significant, as though she were gradually unveiling something fundamental about the nature of the cosmos. Nicomedes arrived near the end of the afternoon, having become a regular presence at her table by this point. He observed the intensity of her focus and waited patiently until she had completed her current calculation before speaking. "You seem particularly engaged today," he observed with gentle humor. "I have rarely seen you work with such concentrated energy." Hypatia looked up from her materials and smiled, a subtle expression that conveyed both amusement and satisfaction. "I have had a remarkable insight," she explained. "A colleague has provided me with astronomical observations that, when combined with my own work, seem to reveal new patterns. Come, look at this." She guided Nicomedes through her reasoning, showing him how the observations and calculations fit together, and how the patterns seemed to suggest a deeper coherence in the movements of celestial bodies. As she explained, she could see his mind working through the logic, following the connections, arriving at genuine understanding. "This is beautiful," Nicomedes said when she had finished. "The elegance of it, the way these patterns fit together, it suggests that the universe itself is constructed on mathematical principles." "Precisely," Hypatia replied. "And this is why the study of mathematics is so important. Through mathematics, we learn to read the language in which the universe expresses itself. We learn to perceive the deep logic that underlies all visible phenomena." As the afternoon deepened toward evening, Hypatia felt a profound sense of contentment. Her work was contributing to genuine understanding. Her students were developing real intellectual capability. The community of scholars in Alexandria was engaged in collective inquiry that transcended any individual effort. All of this seemed to be flowing together into something meaningful and significant. That evening, as she sat by her window observing the night sky, she felt a particular gratitude for the opportunity to engage in this work. The stars that looked down on her, the same stars that had looked down on countless generations before her, that would continue to look down on countless generations after her death, seemed to represent something eternal and enduring about the human search for understanding. She thought about the vast sweep of human history, about all the minds that had devoted themselves to comprehending the nature of reality, about how her own work was both infinitesimally small and infinitely significant within that larger narrative. She was but one scholar among countless others, yet her contribution, however modest, was part of the great ongoing conversation between humanity and the cosmos. As the night deepened, she prepared herself for sleep. Her body settled into rest, Her breathing became slow and deep, but her mind continued to contemplate the patterns she had discovered, the relationships she had uncovered, the possibilities that seemed to be emerging from her work. Sleep came gradually, bringing with it dreams of celestial movements and mathematical relationships. In her dreams, she seemed to float among the stars, observing their patterns directly, understanding the principles that govern their movements with complete clarity. The dreams held a quality of profound peace and rightness, as though her consciousness was finally merging completely with the objects of her lifelong study. Days continued to flow into one another with the gentle inevitability of natural cycles. The summer deepened around Alexandria. The heat increased, though the library remained relatively cool with its thick stone walls and high windows. Hypatia continued her work with steady dedication, arriving each morning, engaging in focused inquiry, teaching students, and departing each evening with the satisfaction of a day spent in meaningful pursuit. One afternoon, a messenger arrived at the library with a request from the governor of Alexandria. He had heard of Hypatia's expertise in mathematics and astronomy and wished to consult with her regarding the design of a new public building he was planning. He requested that she come to his residence to discuss the matter. Hypatia accepted the invitation with quiet grace. She had never sought public recognition or official positions, but neither did she refuse opportunities to contribute her knowledge to the service of the broader community. She arranged with the library attendants to leave her materials organized for her return, and she made her way through the afternoon streets toward the governor's residence. The consultation took several hours. The governor was planning an ambitious architectural project, a new administrative building that would require precise mathematical calculation to ensure structural integrity and aesthetic proportion. Hypatia listened carefully as he described his vision, and then she offered her observations and recommendations. She discussed how the principles of mathematical proportion could be applied to the design, how geometric relationships could create both structural stability and visual beauty. She spoke of the importance of understanding the underlying mathematics of construction, of ensuring that the building would not merely appear beautiful, but would also be fundamentally sound. The governor listened with genuine interest, taking notes as she spoke, asking clarifying questions that suggested he possessed a real desire to understand rather than simply to give orders. By the time the consultation concluded, he had arranged for Hypatia to be consulted regularly during the design and construction phases of the project. As she made her way home that evening, Hypatia reflected on the conversation. It was gratifying to see mathematical principles being applied to practical purposes, to know that her understanding of geometric relationships could contribute to the creation of something tangible and beneficial to the city. Yet she also recognized that this kind of applied work, while valuable, was different from the pure inquiry that remained the deepest expression of her intellectual passion. That night, as she sat by her window observing the stars, she felt a kind of peace about this balance in her life. She would continue her work in the library, pursuing mathematical and astronomical understanding for its own sake. But she would also engage in these practical applications, recognizing that genuine knowledge had value both in its pursuit and in its use. The weeks continued their progression. The summer began gradually to give way to early autumn. The quality of the light shifted subtly. The heat, while still present, became slightly less intense. And through it all, Hypatia continued her work. The same patterns of morning arrival, focused inquiry, teaching, evening observation, and rest. One evening, as she sat by her window, she found herself contemplating the nature of her own life with unusual explicitness. She was now 46 years old, with perhaps another 2 or 3 decades remaining before her earthly life came to its end. She had devoted these years entirely to the pursuit of understanding, had never married, had no children of her own blood, had accumulated no significant wealth or property. By the standards of many, her life might have seemed austere or limited, yet she recognized it to be precisely the opposite. Within the apparently simple pattern of her daily existence lay infinite richness. Each day brought new opportunities for understanding, new possibilities for discovery, new chances to contribute to the great collective human project of comprehending the nature of reality. She had been granted the extraordinary privilege of living according to her deepest values, of having access to humanity's accumulated knowledge, of being able to contribute to that knowledge, of being able to guide younger minds in their own journeys of understanding. How could such a life be considered limited or austere? That night, she fell asleep with a particularly deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for her opportunities, for her abilities, for the community of scholars within which she worked, for the stars that had guided her studies, for the mathematical principles that seemed to reveal ever deeper layers of meaning as she engaged with them. The dreams that came were gentle and rich, filled with patterns and relationships, with the beauty of mathematical truth expressed in countless forms. And when she woke the next morning, she rose with the same quiet purpose that had characterized her days for as long as she could remember, ready to return to the library, ready to engage once again in the work that gave her life its deepest meaning. Autumn deepened around Alexandria. The heat that had characterized the summer gradually released its grip, replaced by a mild and pleasant warmth. The quality of the light shifted into softer tones. The city's rhythms adjusted to accommodate the changing season, though the library remained relatively unaffected by these external transformations, its stone walls providing a constant environment of controlled temperature and steady illumination. Hypatia's life continued its familiar pattern, yet within that pattern, subtle developments continued to unfold. Her work on the geometric problem that had occupied her attention since the beginning of summer had gradually evolved. While she still had not discovered a definitive solution to the ancient puzzle of converting the area of a circle into the area of a square, she had developed a much deeper understanding of the mathematical relationships involved. She had created a series of geometric proofs that, while not solving the problem completely, demonstrated relationships and principles that would be valuable for future mathematicians to build upon. This too represented genuine progress, the understanding that one's own work, even if incomplete, could contribute to the larger edifice of human knowledge. Nicomedes had become a regular and valued presence at her side. His initial struggles with mathematical concepts had given way to genuine competence and growing mastery. He had begun to develop his own independent inquiries, sometimes bringing his own problems to discuss with her rather than simply asking her to explain established principles. One afternoon, as they worked together, Nicomedes posed a question that surprised her with its originality. He had been observing the movements of the moon and had noticed something about its phases that seemed to suggest a mathematical relationship he could not quite articulate. "Observe," he said, drawing diagrams on a wax tablet. "The moon appears to follow a cycle of phases: new moon, growing crescent, full moon, waning crescent, and then new moon again. But I notice that the number of days in this cycle varies slightly. Does this suggest that the moon's orbit is not perfectly regular, or is my observation faulty?" Hypatia examined his diagrams carefully. His observation was sound, and she felt a surge of satisfaction at the recognition that her student had developed the capacity to make genuine, original observations, rather than simply receiving instruction. "Your observation is accurate," she replied. "The lunar cycle is indeed slightly variable. The reasons for this are complex and relate to the interaction between the moon's orbit and the Earth's orbit around the sun. Several Greek astronomers have attempted to explain this variation. Would you like to examine their work?" They spent the next several hours exploring astronomical texts that addressed the lunar cycle. Hypatia guided Nicomedes through the mathematical reasoning, helping him to understand the geometric models that different astronomers had proposed to account for the observed variations. By the time he departed that afternoon, Nicomedes carried with him both new understanding and a sense of participating in a conversation that stretched across centuries. His own observations connecting with those of ancient astronomers, his questions resonating with the same inquiries that had occupied great minds in distant past epochs. Later that same week, Theon returned to the library with exciting news. He had shared some of Hypatia's observations with other scholars, and these observations had generated considerable interest. Several mathematicians and astronomers from other parts of the Mediterranean world had written to him, expressing their own ideas and observations, hoping to engage in correspondence and discussion with Hypatia. "Your work is becoming known beyond Alexandria," Theon explained, settling into his familiar chair beside her. "There is genuine excitement about your astronomical observations and your geometric investigations. Many believe you are approaching something significant, a synthesis of mathematical principle and astronomical observation that could transform how we understand the cosmos." Hypatia received this news with characteristic calm, neither inflated by the recognition nor dismissive of it. She understood that the validation of other scholars was valuable. It confirmed that her work was contributing something genuine to collective human understanding. Yet she also recognized that the deepest reward remained the work itself, the daily engagement with genuine intellectual material, the gradual unveiling of truth through patient inquiry. "I am grateful for this recognition," she said to Theon, "and I would be interested in engaging in correspondence with these other scholars. Yet I must confess that I remain most deeply motivated by the work itself, rather than by external acknowledgement. If my investigations never became known beyond this city, I would continue them with the same dedication I bring to them now." Theon smiled, understanding perfectly what she meant. He too had devoted himself to genuine inquiry rather than to the pursuit of recognition, and he appreciated her integrity in remaining focused on the quality of her work rather than on its external reception. As autumn progressed, Hypatia found herself increasingly engaged with correspondence from distant scholars. She would receive letters several times each week, carried by merchants traveling the Mediterranean trade routes. Some contained observations, detailed records of astronomical phenomena observed from distant locations. Others posed questions, seeking her insights on particular mathematical or astronomical problems. Still others offered theoretical frameworks or alternative explanations for phenomena she had observed. The work of responding to this correspondence, of engaging with these distant minds, added a new dimension to her daily activities. Yet it did not replace her core work in the library. Rather, it enriched and deepened her engagement with the problems she was investigating. Each new perspective from a distant scholar seemed to illuminate her own thinking from a new angle. One evening, as she sat composing a response to a particularly interesting question posed by an astronomer working in the coastal city of Rhodes, she became aware of a particular quality of satisfaction settling over her. She was 52 years old, an age at which many scholars had already withdrawn from active intellectual work. Yet she felt her mind to be as engaged and vital as ever. The work itself seemed to sustain her, to provide the energy and focus that kept her continuously oriented toward understanding. She thought about the students she had taught over the years, young men and women who had come to the library seeking understanding, and had gradually developed genuine intellectual capability. Many of them had moved on to other pursuits, but several remained engaged with mathematics and astronomy in various capacities. Nicomedes, in particular, had become a genuinely accomplished mathematician, capable of making original contributions to the field. This too was a form of immortality, she reflected, not the immortality of fame or lasting recognition, but the more profound immortality of having shaped minds, of having contributed to the development of human understanding in ways that would continue beyond her own lifetime. Her students would teach others, who would still teach others. The understanding she had helped to cultivate would ripple forward through generations. As winter began to approach, Alexandria took on particular qualities of beauty. The intense summer heat had fully released its grip. The light became increasingly clear and crystalline. The stars, when observed on clear nights, seemed to shine with particular brilliance, as though the cooler air allowed them to be perceived with greater clarity. Hypatia spent one evening on the flat roof of a friend's residence, observing the winter stars with a particularly sophisticated astronomical instrument that had been recently acquired. As she made her observations, carefully recording the positions and brightnesses of various celestial bodies, she felt a profound sense of being present within something vast and eternal. The stars she was observing had been looked upon by countless generations of humans stretching back into prehistoric antiquity. They would be observed by countless generations yet to come. Her own moment of observation, while infinitesimally small within this vast temporal sweep, was also genuinely meaningful, a moment in which human consciousness, through her eyes and mind, was achieving direct connection with these distant celestial bodies. This paradox, the simultaneous insignificance and profound significance of her individual existence, seemed to be resolved in the understanding that came through genuine engagement with reality. She was small, temporary, limited in her individual capacity. Yet through her participation in the collective human project of understanding, through her commitment to truth and inquiry, she was participating in something that transcended these limitations. When she returned to her dwelling that night and lay down to sleep, her mind was suffused with contentment. The work continued. The inquiry progressed. Understanding deepened. And she remained at the center of it all, engaged in the daily practice of attending to reality with complete care and dedication. Winter settled around Alexandria with gentle authority. While the city did not experience the harsh winters of northern regions, the season brought subtle changes, cooler temperatures, clearer skies, a shift in the quality of light. The library, with its thick stone walls, became a particularly welcome refuge, cool and calm, a stable environment for focused intellectual work. Hypatia's routines remained consistent, yet the progression of seasons had gradually begun to mark the passage of time in her awareness. She was now in her late 50s, and while her mind remained as sharp as ever, she had begun to notice subtle changes in her physical body. She moved with perhaps slightly less fluidity than in her younger years. Her energy, while still considerable, seemed to require slightly more recovery between intensive work sessions. Yet these physical changes brought with them no sense of loss or regret. Rather, they seemed to deepen her appreciation for the work she was able to continue, for the time she was still being granted to pursue her inquiries. She recognized that every day of continued engagement was a gift, not something to be taken for granted. One morning in early winter, as she arrived at the library, she found a young woman waiting at the entrance. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with an expression that combined both nervousness and determination. "I have come seeking to study with you," the woman said respectfully. "My father is a merchant, and he has arranged for my education to be continued here. But I confess I am uncertain whether a woman will be welcomed in the serious study of mathematics and astronomy." Hypatia looked at the young woman. Her name was Sophia, with genuine warmth. "Come," she said, gesturing toward the library interior. "There is no law written in the nature of mathematics or the cosmos that excludes women from understanding them. If you have genuine interest and willingness to engage in patient inquiry, then you will be welcomed here." And so Sophia became one of her students, the first woman to study with her in several years. The young woman proved to have both genuine intellectual ability and remarkable dedication. She came to the library nearly every day, working through the foundational materials, gradually building her understanding of geometric principles and astronomical observations. Watching Sophia develop her understanding, Hypatia felt a particular satisfaction. She herself had been fortunate in having access to serious intellectual work, but she recognized that many women were denied this opportunity. By welcoming Sophia and other women into her teaching, she was helping to ensure that intellectual capability, regardless of the gender of the individual possessing it, could be developed and honored. The weeks progressed into the full depth of winter. Hypatia's daily routine remained consistent: the morning arrival at the library, the focused work on various mathematical and astronomical problems, the teaching of Nicomedes and Sophia and other students, the evening observation of the stars when weather permitted, the return to her dwelling for rest and renewal. One particularly clear evening in the depths of winter, as she stood on the roof observing the stars, she became aware of a subtle shift in her own consciousness. She had been studying the stars and developing mathematical models to explain their movements for so many decades that, in some sense, she had come to identify with the work itself. The pursuit of understanding had become so central to her being that it seemed almost synonymous with existence itself. She thought about what would occur after her death, how the work would continue, how other scholars would build upon the foundation she and her colleagues had established. Her own individual contributions would gradually be integrated into the larger edifice of human knowledge, their specific origins eventually becoming obscured as later scholars built upon them. There was profound peace in this recognition. She did not seek to have her name remembered, though she did not refuse it either. Rather, she recognized that the value of her work transcended questions of personal recognition or memorial. The work itself was what mattered, the gradual, patient accumulation of human understanding, the slow unveiling of the deep principles that govern the cosmos. That night, as she lay in her bed, she fell asleep with a particularly deep sense of purpose and completion. She had devoted her life to genuine inquiry. She had cultivated her own understanding and had guided younger minds in developing theirs. She had contributed observations and insights that would be woven into the larger fabric of human knowledge. She had lived in alignment with her deepest values and had asked nothing more from existence than the opportunity to continue this work. As sleep embraced her fully, her dreams seemed to synthesize all the work of her lifetime. The mathematical patterns and astronomical observations appearing together in harmonious relationship, revealing a beauty and coherence that seemed to transcend any individual human effort. In the dreams, she seemed to be observing the universe from a perspective of complete understanding, perceiving the elegant principles that governed all phenomena with absolute clarity. And as she rested through the winter night, surrounded by the mild darkness and the distant presence of the stars, Hypatia seemed to achieve a kind of union with the objects of her lifelong study, her consciousness merging with the vast cosmos, her individual mind becoming one with the mathematical principles that ordered all existence. Morning would come again, bringing with it another day, another opportunity for work and understanding. But in this night of deep rest, she seemed to have achieved something beyond the daily cycles of inquiry and sleep, a kind of permanent alignment of her being with the fundamental nature of reality itself. The new year arrived with the subtle shifts that marked the transition of seasons in the Mediterranean world. The winter deepened toward its conclusion, and already the first hints of coming spring could be perceived in the lengthening of days and the slight warming of air. Hypatia, now in her early 60s, continued her routines with the consistency that had characterized her entire adult life. She rose in the mornings and made her way to the library as she always did. Her work-reddened hands, marked by decades of handling papyrus and vellum, continued their careful movements across wax tablets and geometric diagrams. Her graying brown hair, now more silver than brown, she bound with the same simplicity as always. Her dark eyes, though showing the gentleness that comes with advancing age, remained focused and alert when turned toward the work of understanding. The library had become her truest home over these many years. The stone corridors, the carefully organized scrolls, the familiar workspaces, all of it held the accumulated memory of countless hours of serious intellectual engagement. When she entered those spaces each morning, she felt the presence of all the minds that had studied there before her, all the knowledge that had been preserved and transmitted within those walls. Sophia had continued to develop steadily in her studies. The young woman now possessed genuine competence in geometric principles and was beginning to engage with astronomical observations with increasing sophistication. She had also begun to take on some teaching responsibilities, working with younger students who came to the library seeking basic instruction in mathematics. Nicomedes, meanwhile, had become genuinely accomplished in his own right. He had begun to make independent astronomical observations, recording the positions and movements of celestial bodies with meticulous care. He was developing his own theories about the underlying mathematical principles governing these movements, drawing on the foundation Hypatia had helped him establish, but extending beyond it into genuinely original territory. Watching her students develop their own independent capabilities brought Hypatia particular satisfaction. She had never sought to create followers or disciples who simply reproduced her own thinking. Rather, she had always aimed to cultivate genuine intellectual independence, to help younger minds develop the capacity to engage with reality directly, to ask their own questions, to pursue their own inquiries with integrity and rigor. One afternoon, as she was reviewing some of Nicomedes' recent observations, she found herself contemplating the nature of legacy and transmission. Her own teacher had passed away many years ago, yet her influence remained present in Hypatia's work every day. She had built upon his foundation, extended his insights, but also moved beyond them into new territory. Now, in turn, she was providing a foundation for Nicomedes and Sophia and other students. They would build upon what she had taught them, but they would also move beyond it, creating new understanding that she herself might never achieve. This process of transmission and innovation, extending backward through history and forward into the future, seemed to her the truest form of human continuity, not the preservation of any individual's particular insights unchanged, but rather the ongoing conversation between minds across generations, each one contributing their own effort to the great collective project of understanding. As winter gave way to spring, the quality of light in the library shifted once again. The sun's angle changed incrementally, altering the patterns of illumination that filled the high windows. The air began to warm. The scent of the Mediterranean, carried by increasingly gentle breezes, seemed to permeate even the interior spaces of the stone library. Spring in Alexandria brought with it a sense of renewal and vitality. Merchants returned to the ports after winter's more cautious sailing seasons. Trade began to intensify. The marketplace grew more crowded and bustling. The entire city seemed to shake off the relative quiet of winter and return to more active commerce and social engagement. Yet within the library, the rhythms remained steady and measured. The work of serious inquiry did not accelerate with the seasons. Rather, it maintained its own consistent pace, indifferent to external cycles of activity and rest. One afternoon in mid-spring, a messenger arrived at the library with a sealed letter. The seal indicated it came from a prominent physician and scholar working in the coastal city of Antioch. Hypatia opened it with the mixture of curiosity and calm that she brought to all communications. The letter contained a lengthy question about the relationship between astronomical observation and medical practice. The physician had been studying the classical texts that claimed certain illnesses were influenced by the positions of celestial bodies, and he was seeking Hypatia's perspective on whether her astronomical observations supported or contradicted these claims. Hypatia spent the remainder of the afternoon composing a careful response. She explained her view that while there might be genuine correlations between certain astronomical phenomena and natural occurrences on Earth, these correlations required careful observation and rigorous testing, rather than acceptance based on ancient authority alone. She described her own process of careful observation, meticulous record-keeping, and patient analysis. She emphasized that genuine understanding came not from accepting received wisdom uncritically, but from engaging directly with phenomena, asking careful questions, and allowing evidence to guide one's conclusions, even when those conclusions contradicted established beliefs. Writing this response, she felt the familiar satisfaction that came from articulating principles that had guided her own work throughout her lifetime. The commitment to direct observation, to honest inquiry, to following the evidence wherever it led. These were the foundations upon which all genuine knowledge must be built. As spring deepened toward summer, Hypatia found herself increasingly absorbed in a new project. She had begun to compile her lifetime of astronomical observations into a systematic document, a record that would be preserved in the library for future scholars to study and build upon. This work was different from her usual mathematical and astronomical investigations. It was not aimed at discovering new understanding, but rather at organizing and recording the understanding she had already achieved. Yet this compilatory work held its own kind of satisfaction. As she organized her observations, she found herself recognizing patterns and relationships that had not been apparent when she was in the midst of the original investigations. The act of careful organization and synthesis seemed to deepen her understanding, even as she was preparing to record it for others. Nicomedes and Sophia both assisted with this project. They helped to organize materials, to verify calculations, to ensure that the record was accurate and complete. In doing so, they were learning not just the specific content of Hypatia's observations, but also the broader methodology of careful scholarship. How to organize knowledge, how to preserve it in forms that would be accessible to future scholars, how to ensure that one's own work could be built upon by those who came after. One evening, as the three of them worked together organizing the materials, Hypatia paused and looked around the library. The familiar spaces held all the accumulated knowledge of centuries. Ancient texts preserved from classical times existed side by side with more recent works. Manuscripts in various languages, Greek, Latin, occasionally others, represented the intellectual achievements of diverse peoples and cultures. "This library," she said to Nicomedes and Sophia, "represents something precious and fragile. All of this knowledge, accumulated over centuries, could be lost in a single moment if not carefully preserved and transmitted. Our work here, both the work of understanding and the work of organizing and recording that understanding, is part of a larger process of preservation and transmission." She gestured toward the shelves around them. "Every scroll here represents the life's work of some scholar who devoted years to understanding some aspect of reality. When we study these texts, we are in conversation with minds that lived centuries ago. When we add our own observations and insights, we are making contributions that future scholars will build upon. We are links in a chain of understanding that extends far beyond our individual lives." Sophia and Nicomedes both nodded, understanding the significance of what she was expressing. They had come to appreciate, through their work with Hypatia, that scholarship was not an isolated individual pursuit, but rather a collective enterprise extending through time. As summer approached and the days grew longer, Hypatia's energy seemed to remain steady despite her advancing age. The work itself seemed to sustain her, providing purpose and focus that kept her engaged and vital. She still arrived at the library each morning with the same quiet purpose that had characterized her for decades. Her mind remained sharp, her capacity for concentration undiminished. Yet she had begun to notice subtle changes. Her energy, while still considerable, seemed to require slightly more recovery. Her hands, though still capable and strong, occasionally ached with the kind of discomfort that suggested the gradual wearing of age. She moved more slowly through the library corridors, though this gave her more opportunity to notice details that perhaps she had overlooked when moving more quickly. These physical changes brought with them no sense of urgency or anxiety. Rather, they seemed natural and acceptable, the inevitable progression that all bodies underwent. She had lived a long life devoted to work she loved, and had been granted the extraordinary privilege of pursuing understanding for more than 6 decades. If the physical body was beginning to show signs of age, this seemed a small price to pay for the life she had been able to live. One evening, as she sat by her window observing the emerging stars in the twilight sky, she found herself reflecting on the arc of her life. She had been born into a family of scholars and had been educated in ways that many of her female contemporaries would never have the opportunity to experience. She had devoted her entire adult life to the pursuit of understanding, and had never compromised her intellectual integrity for the sake of social convention or external approval. She had helped guide the intellectual development of numerous students. She had made contributions to mathematical and astronomical knowledge that had been recognized by scholars across the Mediterranean world. She had lived in alignment with her deepest values and had asked nothing from existence except the opportunity to continue this work. Looking back over these many decades, she felt a profound sense of completion, not the sense that her work was finished or that there was nothing left to understand, but rather the sense that she had lived well, that her life had had genuine meaning and purpose, that she had contributed something of value to the human project of understanding the cosmos. That night, as she lay down to sleep, she felt a particular peace settling over her. The work would continue. Other minds would take up the questions she was exploring. Her own contributions would gradually be woven into the larger fabric of human knowledge. And this was as it should be. Individual lives were temporary. Understanding was eternal. By devoting herself completely to the pursuit of understanding, she had achieved a kind of participation in something that transcended her individual mortality. Her breathing became slow and deep. Her body relaxed into rest, and as consciousness began to fade into sleep, she seemed to drift into that same state she had experienced so many times before, a dissolution of the boundary between her individual mind and something vastly larger, a merging of her awareness with the mathematical principles and celestial patterns that had occupied her attention for a lifetime. In sleep, the patterns seemed to continue their eternal dance, circles and spirals, the movements of stars and planets, the elegant relationships that governed all visible phenomena. And Hypatia's consciousness seemed to participate in this dance, observing and understanding, at peace in the recognition that understanding itself was a form of communion with the fundamental nature of reality. In sleep, the patterns seemed to continue their eternal dance, circles and spirals, the movements of stars and planets, the elegant relationships that governed all visible phenomena. And Hypatia's consciousness seemed to participate in this dance, observing and understanding, at peace in the recognition that understanding itself was a form of communion with the fundamental nature of reality. Morning would come again, the work would continue, but for now, in this night of deep rest, all was quiet and complete. All was as it should be. All was well. Summer arrived fully around Alexandria, bringing with it the heat and light that characterized the season in the Mediterranean world. The days grew longer, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter and shorter shadows as noon approached. The library, with its thick stone walls and high windows, remained a cool refuge from the external heat. Hypatia now moved through her daily routines with a calm acceptance of the physical limitations that age had gradually introduced. Her body required slightly more rest between periods of focused work. Her hands, though still capable and strong, occasionally needed moments of gentleness and care. Yet her mind remained sharp, her commitment to the work undiminished. The compilation project she had undertaken had neared completion. The organized record of her lifetime of astronomical observations was taking shape, a document that would preserve not just the specific data she had gathered, but also the methodology and reasoning that had guided her investigations. Sophia had taken an increasingly active role in organizing and refining this material, working with the kind of care and precision that suggested she might eventually become a compiler and preservationist of knowledge in her own right. One particularly warm afternoon, as Hypatia was reviewing some of the compiled materials with Sophia, a visitor arrived at the library, a scholar from the city of Rome who had traveled for many weeks to meet her. The man was named Marcus, and he carried letters of introduction from several prominent scholars who knew Hypatia's work well. "I have come," Marcus explained, "because I am attempting to synthesize the astronomical and mathematical knowledge that has been accumulated across the entire known world. I have heard that your observations are among the most precise and systematic that have been made, and I hope to benefit from your insights and perhaps to convince you to allow your work to be included in my comprehensive compilation." Hypatia received him with characteristic warmth and without pretense. She spent several hours with Marcus, describing her methodology, discussing her observations, answering his questions with the patience and clarity that had always characterized her teaching. By the time Marcus departed, late in the afternoon, he carried with him copies of several of Hypatia's most significant works and the promise of ongoing correspondence. Hypatia recognized that this visitor represented yet another thread in the vast network of scholars extending across the Mediterranean world, all of them engaged in the collective work of gathering and systematizing human knowledge. That evening, as she walked home through the streets of Alexandria, she felt a particular awareness of her own place within this larger network. Her work, which she had pursued in relative solitude for so many decades, was now recognized as part of a larger intellectual movement, an effort to preserve, organize, and extend human understanding across the vast geographic expanse of the known world. There was something both humbling and deeply satisfying about this recognition. She had never sought public acknowledgement or fame, yet now that recognition was arriving, it seemed to confirm that her life's work had genuine value and significance. Her observations and insights would not disappear with her death, but would be preserved and built upon by other scholars. The summer deepened, and with it came a subtle shift in Hypatia's awareness. She had begun to contemplate, with increasing explicit clarity, the question of mortality. She was now in her middle 60s, an age at which many did not survive, particularly in the ancient world. She had been granted an unusually long life, and she recognized this as a gift rather than something to be taken for granted. When she contemplated her eventual death, she found herself feeling not fear or regret, but rather a kind of peaceful acceptance. She had lived a life completely devoted to meaningful purpose. She had used her gifts in service to understanding. She had guided younger minds in developing their own intellectual capabilities. She had contributed observations and insights that would outlast her individual existence. What more could one ask from a life? She had no unfulfilled ambitions, no sense that she had left important work undone. The work would continue after her death. Her students would carry it forward. Others would build upon the foundation she had helped to establish. The great conversation between human understanding and the nature of reality would continue indefinitely, each generation of scholars adding their own contributions. One evening, as she sat by her window observing the stars, she found herself speaking these thoughts aloud. A practice she rarely engaged in, living as she did in relative solitude. "I am ready," she said to the stars, to the cosmos, to whatever vast intelligence might or might not be observing her small human consciousness. "I am ready to release this body, this individual existence. I have used it as fully as I could. I have devoted it to purposes that I believe are noble and true. If there is more to come after this life, I welcome it with peaceful curiosity. If there is only the return to the elements from which all bodies are formed, I accept that too with gratitude." Speaking these words, she felt a profound relief, as though the acceptance of her own mortality had freed her from any remaining anxiety or urgency. Her life had genuine meaning. Her work had genuine value. Whatever came after was secondary to this fundamental truth. Late summer arrived, and with it came a subtle intensification of the heat. The sun beat down on Alexandria with relentless intensity. The library, despite its stone walls, began to feel the cumulative effect of weeks of heat. Some of the older scholars began to reduce their activities, spending more time in their homes or in the cooler parts of the city. Hypatia, however, continued her routines with characteristic consistency. She arrived at the library each morning, engaging in her usual work. Yet those who saw her began to notice that she moved more slowly, that she rested more frequently, that there was a quality of gentleness in her movements that suggested she was conserving her energy. Sophia and Nicomedes both noticed these subtle changes. They began to offer assistance more frequently, helping her to organize materials, to move between different sections of the library, to carry the texts and tablets she needed for her work. Hypatia accepted this assistance with grace, understanding that they were offering it from genuine affection and respect rather than from any sense of obligation. One afternoon, as Hypatia was preparing to leave the library and return home, she felt a sudden dizziness, a subtle vertigo that caused her to pause and place her hand against the stone wall for support. Nicomedes, who was nearby, immediately moved to her side, offering his arm for stability. "I am fine," Hypatia said calmly, though she recognized that something had shifted in her body. The heat of summer can be demanding, even for those of us who have lived many years in the Mediterranean sun. "I will rest this evening and will likely be restored by tomorrow." But the dizziness did not fully resolve. Over the following days, she found herself tiring more quickly than usual. Her energy, which had remained remarkably consistent for her age, began to flag noticeably. She continued to arrive at the library each day, but she worked for shorter periods and rested more frequently. The other scholars began to express concern. Her colleagues suggested that perhaps she should reduce her activities for a time, should rest more completely, and should allow her body to recover from whatever subtle illness might be affecting her. But Hypatia, with characteristic single-mindedness, continued her work. She had materials she wanted to complete. She had students who depended on her guidance. She had correspondence to maintain with distant scholars. The work was too important, in her view, to be interrupted by the temporary discomforts of a body that was beginning to fail. Yet even as she continued her work, she began to make subtle preparations for the possibility that she might not be granted significantly more years. She worked with Sophia to ensure that all of her materials, her notes, her observations, her compiled works, were organized in ways that would be accessible to future scholars. She took extra care to explain her reasoning and methodology, ensuring that those who came after her could understand not just what she had discovered, but how she had come to those discoveries. One afternoon, as she was working with Sophia on organizing her lifetime collection of astronomical observations, she paused and looked directly at the young woman. "You have developed genuine intellectual capability," Hypatia said quietly. "You have the potential to make significant contributions to the field of mathematics and astronomy. But I want you to promise me something. I want you to promise that you will never allow external pressure, whether from social convention, from those who doubt women's intellectual capacity, or from any other source, to deflect you from your commitment to genuine inquiry. Promise me that you will pursue understanding with the same integrity and dedication that I have tried to model." Sophia's eyes filled with tears at the intensity of this request. "I promise," she said simply. "I will honor what you have taught me. I will continue the work." As late summer gave way to early autumn, Hypatia's condition gradually became more apparent to those around her. She continued to arrive at the library most days, but her periods of work grew shorter, her rest periods longer. There was a quality of determination in her continued appearance, as though she was drawing on deeper resources of will to maintain her routines, even as her physical body was gradually losing its capacity to sustain them. The other scholars in the library began to watch her with a kind of reverent awareness. They recognized that they were witnessing something significant, an elder scholar persisting in her work, despite the obvious challenges her body was presenting. There was something noble and dignified in her continued commitment to the work, even in the face of physical limitation. One particular afternoon, as the heat of summer was finally beginning to release its grip, and the first hints of autumn's cooler air were becoming perceptible, Hypatia sat at her familiar table, working on a final set of calculations. The problem she was exploring was not one she had never examined before, but rather one she was approaching from a new angle, a final exploration of the geometric relationships that had occupied her attention for so many decades. As she worked, she found herself in that state of complete absorption that had always been the greatest reward of her intellectual endeavors. The external world fell away. There was only the work, the problem, the gradual unveiling of understanding. The heat of the day, the awareness of her physical limitations, the knowledge of her own approaching mortality, all of these receded into insignificance in the face of genuine engagement with mathematical truth. By late afternoon, as the light was beginning its transition toward evening, she set down her stylus and allowed herself to contemplate what she had discovered. It was a small insight, perhaps not significant in the grand scheme of mathematical knowledge. Yet it represented a completion of sorts, a final synthesis of decades of work, a way of bringing together threads that had occupied her attention for a lifetime. She looked around the library, at the familiar shelves holding countless scrolls, at the other scholars engaged in their work, at the steady stream of light falling through the high windows, at the space that had become as much her home as any dwelling could be. "Thank you," she whispered, though she was not entirely certain to whom she was offering this gratitude. Perhaps it was to the universe itself, for the opportunity to exist and to engage with its mysteries. Perhaps it was to all those who had come before her, whose knowledge had been preserved and transmitted so that she could study it and build upon it. Perhaps it was simply an acknowledgement of the profound privilege that her life had been. As the evening bells began their distant call, signaling the transition from afternoon work to evening rest, Hypatia rose slowly from her chair. She gathered her materials with the same care she had always brought to this task, organizing them so that they would be immediately available the next day. Yet as she walked through the library corridors toward the exit, she seemed to move more slowly than usual. Each step appeared to require more deliberation and care. Nicomedes, observing from across the room, rose quickly and moved to her side, offering his arm. She accepted his assistance gratefully, and together they walked toward the library entrance. As they emerged into the courtyard outside, the sky was already taking on the colors of approaching dusk. The heat of the day was beginning to release. The first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. "Go home and rest," Nicomedes urged gently. "You have worked hard. You deserve to complete your day in peace." Hypatia nodded slowly. "Yes," she agreed. "I believe I will return home and allow myself to rest. I am perhaps more tired than I have been in some time." But as she made her way through the streets of Alexandria, moving slowly toward her dwelling, she felt an unusual quality of detachment from her physical body. She seemed to be observing herself walking through the familiar streets as though from a slight distance. The city around her seemed somehow both intensely real and slightly dreamlike. When she arrived at her home, the household servants had already prepared her evening meal and had opened the windows to catch the cooler evening air. She ate a small portion of the food and then moved to her sleeping chamber. As she lay on her bed, she became aware of a gentle loosening of the bonds that held her consciousness to her physical form. It was not uncomfortable. Rather, it was like the gradual release of a long-held tension. She seemed to be approaching that threshold between wakefulness and sleep, yet there was something different about this transition than what she had experienced thousands of times before. Her breathing became slow and shallow. Her awareness seemed to expand beyond the boundaries of her body. She found herself contemplating not just the room in which she lay, but the entire city of Alexandria beyond the walls, the Mediterranean beyond the city, the earth itself floating in the vast cosmos, and the stars, the eternal stars that had guided her observations and her understanding for a lifetime. It occurred to her with a kind of gentle certainty that this night's sleep might be different from all the others. Yet there was no fear in this recognition, only a kind of peaceful acceptance. She had lived a complete life. She had done her work. She had contributed what she could to human understanding. Whatever came next, she was ready. As consciousness gradually faded, she seemed to float among the stars themselves, observing them from some perspective beyond physical embodiment. The mathematical relationships she had devoted her life to understanding seemed to reveal themselves with complete clarity. The deep order that underlay all visible phenomena became apparent in its full elegance and beauty. And in this final moment of conscious awareness, Hypatia seemed to achieve that union with the cosmos that she had always sought through her intellectual work, a complete merging of her understanding with the fundamental nature of reality itself. All was peaceful, all was understanding, all was home. The morning sun rose over Alexandria as it always did, casting its gentle light across the ancient city and the great library that held humanity's accumulated knowledge. The stars that had guided Hypatia's observations for so many decades continued their eternal rotation through the heavens, moving according to the mathematical principles she had devoted her life to understanding. In the library, her materials remained: the organized scrolls, the compiled observations, the careful notes that recorded the methodology of her inquiry. Her students, Nicomedes and Sophia, and countless others who had studied with her over the years, carried forward the work she had begun. The understanding she had cultivated would ripple through generations, each scholar building upon the foundation she had helped to establish. The world continued its turning. The seasons progressed in their eternal cycle. The stars moved through their ancient patterns, and the light of human understanding, kindled in countless minds across countless generations, sustained by the patient work of those devoted to truth, continued to shine forward into the future, illuminating the vast mysteries of existence. All was well, all was complete, all would continue.